I want to move ahead quickly for the sake of time. Probably the biggest challenge in heretical challenge in Adventism, early Adventism, was John Harvey Kellogg. One of the most brilliant individuals in all of our Adventist past. I mean, creative genius, his surgery techniques, his scars were considered legendary. People could recognize it anywhere in the world. Innovated so many different things, made so many different health foods. And at one point, he started teaching some speculative ideas that were questioning God in nature. And so I brought a little bit of show and tell here for you guys today, because this is probably one of the very rarest books in any Adventist archive, The Living Temple. Ever held one of these in your hands before? So you get to hold some Adventist heresy today. Anyways, if you look around page 30, hold on. You guys know how to hold a rare book?
No.
Can I trust you with this book?
Probably not. No. Better give it to Ron.
So first thing you need to know, I'm teaching you basic archives etiquette here, okay? You don't let the book, just let the cover hang down and flop or whatever. You hold a rare book like a V, like this, okay? So you're supporting it with your hands on both sides, okay? And if you have any liquid, please don't keep any liquid near this. Just very carefully pass this around. And I'll talk about this, but about pages 28 to 31 are the famous statements that Ellen White writes about. I will make sure I don't leave without that book. So I will come hunt you down if I have to. Yeah. But while I'm telling you about this, so I'm trusting you here, guys. Kansas-Nebraska. It's my old conference here. I still love you guys, so I want to make sure. But Ellen White had warned about speculative theology, these kinds of ideas that we're questioning the nature of God, who is God and his relationship. And this is where we get into a lot of questions. Some of you were asking, saying these are still questions that people face today. He starts getting into some ideas that are very mystical in nature. Some people have wondered, where did these ideas come from? Well, if you start reading some of the popular theology of liberal theologians in the 1890s, these pantheistic ideas were very, very in vogue, very popular. And so Kellogg was certainly in tune with what was happening in the wider world, and not only the medical world, but the theological landscape. And so he begins to reformulate what Adventism might actually look like. And so, and this is interesting to me because we've had people at various times try to do this. And one of the biggest challenges in the 20th century, not only with Kellogg, but a series of other theologians, including people like Desmond Ford, is to take a new approach to Adventist theology that is less focused on an individual choice. We call that Arminian theology. Ellen White was a Methodist, right? So this idea of personal free will and free choice, and starting to move away into some other kinds of directions. Now, Kellogg will move into a mysticism. Others, like Desmond Ford, will try to push Adventism towards Calvinism, the idea that all are predestined. Either way, you have the same problem at the end of the day. Adventist theology very quickly begins to erode. You start taking doctrines like the sanctuary, which is very much about the intercession of Christ in the sanctuary. And if Christ is if that's some kind of mystical experience, or if it's all predetermined, foreordained by God, the sanctuary doctrine becomes irrelevant. And so it's not surprising to me that through the history of our church, through the 20th century onward, even to the present, the doctrine that will receive the greatest challenges over and over again is the sanctuary doctrine, because it's so integral to the heart and core of our Adventist identity. Well, Kellogg will basically effectively undermine the sanctuary doctrine, undermine several other doctrines at the same time, and Ellen White will she'll raise the warning bell, say this is not heading in the right direction. This is not representative of Adventist theology. And so she writes expressing concerns. Prescott, W.A. Spicer, who I love, one of our greatest, most mission-minded General Conference presidents, a little bit later on. I have these Pioneer socks. We had Spicer socks made. We call them the Spicy Spicer socks, because the quote that I love from Spicer the most is where he writes, when he was elected General Conference president, to his surprise, there are no posts of honor, only those of service. And I love that kind of motto of that philosophy of church leadership. It's not about me, it's about service. Even if I have to get out of the way, even if it means I have to serve, when I promised my wife I will retire and step aside, which is what happened in his case. And the simple version of what happened in 1922 is nobody could agree on who should be the General Conference president, so he ended up being the compromise candidate because everybody hated the other two people so much that they finally elected him as the compromise person instead. And so he got himself in trouble. There were only 2,000 copies of The Living Temple ever printed. It's being passed around. Most of those copies burned in the sanitarium fire, and that's why this is one of the very rarest books in Adventist history.
It's online, isn't it great?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you really want to get into it, Mike, it's all there for you, okay? Now, Kellogg would always deny that he was a pantheist, but his ideas would become intertwined with another revivalist by the name of E.J. Wagner. Now, interestingly, E.J. Wagner and A.T. Jones of 1888 fame, right? The revivals of Christ and His righteousness. Ellen White sees that we need a more Christ-centered approach to our theology. She backs behind them, supports them, saying this is exactly what the church needs. And at one point in 1896, she will say that even if Jones and Wagner were to lose their way, it would not negate the message that they had been teaching. And ironically, guess what? Jones and Wagner lost their way. Wagner is some young sweet thing there, a nurse in England, who he decided was his spiritual wife. And they went ahead and decided to honeymoon on the one of those big ships, whatever, across the Atlantic Ocean coming home. And then, check this out, Ron, he had the audacity to send in his expense report with his new wife. And one of the most awkward things I've ever found in the archives doing research is the rejection letter from W.A. Spicer, head of the Foreign Mission Board, explaining to him why he could not reimburse him for his expense report. So it was on mutual goodwill that the church exists, and so under circumstances such as yours, we cannot reimburse your travel. Awkward moment in the archives. Even still today, just holding that, I'm like, oh, that's a hard letter to have to write. But Wagner will be caught up before he leaves, and Jones, in a power struggle. Who will be in control of the General Conference? This is not a new problem. Church politics, right? Church politics, where people say, and so they had it lined up where A.T. Jones was going to be the next General Conference president. All the cards were on the table in just the right way that at the 1901 General Conference session, that everybody knew Jones was going to be the next General Conference president. And then Ellen White, the prophetic gift, walks into the room. And the prophetic gift can be an unwieldy thing. She says the church needs to change. And when everyone had in their minds who they knew was going to be the General Conference president, this young missionary from Australia that nobody had heard of before, they elected him to be General Conference president instead. And Jones became, this is the beginning of the bitterness and anger that would lead to his leaving the church. And Wagner would leave the church, and so would Kellogg, this trifecta of it was a power struggle. It was a power struggle. And don't think that people don't try to manipulate the church today. It happens at all levels of the church. I was overseas, so I'll be very careful how I say this, because I don't want to anyone say, I know where this happened. But one time, because I've traveled over 100 countries around the world, I was traveling on behalf of the church, and I walked in to a church headquarters. By the way, this was not in the North American division, just to be clear. And when I walked in, they said, "Professor, so nice to see you, but you're not supposed to be here today." And I said, why? I mean, I've always been welcome here before. Today's not a good day. And they said, you should go home. I said, but I came along, I'm here, I don't want to go home. And he said, well, if you have to, go over in the library. But I paused and talked to some other friends, and I realized there's a big truck full of bribes, because the next day was the nominating committee. And the person who wanted to become the next church leader in that region of the world wanted to make sure everyone on the nominating committee had a very special gift. And they were elected. They were. There's a press release afterwards. God ordained this. This was a great blessing from the Lord.
What were the gifts?
Did you get the gift?
I didn't get a gift because I wasn't on the nominating committee. But you know, less than a year later, I was at that person's funeral. And they said, we don't know why the person died. You may be able to orchestrate things in your way and control things and manipulate things a certain way. And God may allow it to happen for whatever reason. But there are times in our church's history where God says, no, enough is enough. And God puts a stop to it. It doesn't happen very often. I love my church. But we also, let's be real, things do happen. In this case, I saw it happen with my own eyes. And this happened in Adventist history in 1901. People thought they had it all in a lock. They knew exactly who was going to be the next General Conference president, A.T. Jones. And God intervened in a very surprising kind of way. And I'm glad when I see that. I see where God intervenes, and I'm thankful for that. One more, Albion Fox Ballinger, and this will set us up for some conspiracy and last generation theology in the second half here, and I'll take a break just a minute. Albion Fox Ballinger challenges the sanctuary doctrine. Here's another little book to hand out and pass around. Here's his most famous book, Power for Witnessing. Interesting thing is the holiness movement in the 1890s, this idea of teaching perfectionism, that one has to have holy flesh in order to be saved. There will actually be a movement called the Holy Flesh Movement. They start laying some of these theological foundations, and Ellen White will challenge that as well. She sees that as antithetical to where the church should actually be going. And so eventually he will leave Adventism. This is his famous book where he leaves Adventism. But the reason why this is significant is we have people that are trying to push Adventism towards a certain theological direction. And we see this even happening today. I was very serious when I was talking about some of our greatest theological challenges have been from people that have tried to move away from Arminian free will, free choice, which if you read Steps to Christ, very clear, crystal clear for Ellen White. And yet other people have come along and said, no, we think we know what's better for the church. And so, and have challenged. And Ballinger was one of those people that certainly did that. He had all of his criticisms. I don't have time to go into all of his criticisms, but it comes down to two different ways of viewing salvation. And this will be important for last generation theology too here. One is monergism versus synergism. Monergism is Calvinist theology, that everything is pre-will, God's foreordained it, and this emphasis upon God's having pre-foreordained what is going to happen in our lives, versus synergism. And Ballinger, he was somebody that was pushing the church towards monergism, this Calvinist kind of way of viewing Adventist theology. And interestingly, who teaches the same stuff as Ballinger? Desmond Ford. Desmond Ford. I thought, this is very interesting. So I read a bunch of his writings this last couple of years, kind of trying to understand and really make sense of his theological... The comparison between the underlying assumptions and challenges facing the church that Ballinger over 100 years before and Desmond Ford in the 1970s and the 1980s are uncanny. Interestingly, Desmond Ford, who was his doctoral advisor? F.F. Bruce, probably one of the most famous New Testament scholars of the 20th century. I was reading a history of theology in the 20th century by a very, very prominent church historians published in the I.B. Torres History of the Christian Church, and says that F.F. Bruce was famous as being a Calvinist scholar that would take young Arminian scholars under his wings, and then he would send them back to their denominations and cause church splits, and gives 5 different examples, none of which is Desmond Ford. And so, we have a 6th case study that fits into this larger paradigm view of what's going on. Sometimes we need to we think we're so special that we're isolated and things only happen to us. But we see that there are these wider patterns that are emerging, and certainly this is very true of Des Ford. I was telling somebody that was a student of Des Ford in the 1970s there at Pacific Union College, and I said, really the challenge with Desmond Ford is that he was kind of a soft Calvinism, pushing the church towards Calvinism, this what we call monergism in systematic theology. He says that's exactly right. All the Adventist pastors in the West Coast in California that he knew, and he named off 30, he said all went to when they left Adventism, went to become pastors in Calvinist churches afterwards. Calvinism and Adventism are antithetical to one another, and yet I think part of it is right now we have so many people reading wider literature in the wider evangelical Christianity, the Christian world landscape, podcasts, books, and things like that, that they're being inculcated with Calvinist theological ideas, so much so that they don't even know that they're imbibing these ideas. And the more they go in that direction, the farther away they're going to get from Adventism. Anyways, I have more of these slides, but I want to get into some good conspiracy theories. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, a short break, and then we'll go into the last part of my materials.